Um, I said this a little bit earlier, but a few new people have joined us. Andrew Lawler, a student, best-selling author and journalist, is joining us this evening to interview Swami Ravi. Andrew, do you want to raise both hands once again? There you go. And he's agreed to participate in our call this evening, our Zoom session this evening. And I'll turn it over to you, Andrew, if you want to say anything about yourself, or feel free.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Carol, and thank you, Swamiji, and everybody for being here tonight. What I really love is seeing the variety of backgrounds that everybody has in their home. It's kind of fabulous. Yeah, this is a great opportunity for me to ask some questions. A couple people have actually given me some questions, and I hope there'll be time for you all to ask your own questions after Rudy and I have a little bit of a conversation. So I thought I'd start off with what in my business is called a softball to Rudy, and that is, I'm curious what Tantric principles really apply that we can really use in the time of a pandemic.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. I guess I would say all of them continue to apply throughout the pandemic. And for those of you who haven't studied much in this tradition, we are talking about the principles of Tantra, which we have outlined as 6 or 7, depending on how you state them. They have to do with the intermarriage. They have to do with the ascending Shakti and the descending light of Shiva, and so forth. And so often when we are practicing this tradition, we kind of think, well, which of the principles come into play here? It's kind of a handy way to get started in terms of applying what you've learned. But I think the one that comes to my mind most at the moment is the multiple realities. And that is a phrase that for us denotes the fact that we as human beings live in different worlds. Well, we don't completely live in one world. We don't totally and simply live in this world of conversation and technology and economy and politics and social issues and so forth. We also live in a world that is related not to the everyday waking consciousness, but it's related to the dream state or the dream world. Or we might say, the Sanskrit word is taijasa, which I like because it sort of means a lot happening, but internally. So it has to do with where we go when we fall asleep. First, well, it varies, but the next level of consciousness that we enter at sleep is dream imagery, the connection of little clippings like from scenes from a movie, or whatever it is that we begin to perceive as we go into the dream state from the waking state. But that also covers a lot of ground, because in that world is the whole the whole complex of archetypes and stories that shape our lives, things we, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, but the stories we tell ourselves about what the world is, the stories we tell ourselves about why we're here, all of that lives in that reality, which we enter normally, meaning the norm. The most common pattern is we enter that as we drift off to sleep. It doesn't stop operating when we wake up. It's still going on, but we're not conscious of it. We set it aside, we push it out of our awareness because we have been unaccustomed or incapacitated in terms of being able to hold at the same moment both the dream world and the everyday waking consciousness. So we've reached this kind of arrangement as human beings on the planet in the last, however many thousands of years, to alternate between a waking state and a sleeping state, so that we can do these, we can enter these realities one at a time, because holding both of them at the same time is too challenging for us. And then beyond the dream state, there's another state, according to the Upanishads. There is a state that is called prajna, which means the first knowing, means, and that sort of corresponds to what sleep studies would call dreamless sleep. So I'm not conscious of this world here, but I'm not conscious of the dream world. I'm conscious of something else that is almost impossible to put into words, almost impossible to communicate. And that first knowing is a very deep, closer connection with, you might say, well, the sages would say, who you really are. Who you really are is the oneness. We are all one, but we say that, but we don't really grasp it. Because to grasp it, we have to leave this reality and go into that reality. And that's something we don't usually do when we're awake, operating in the world. We do it in deep sleep. So this arrangement we've been operating on the basis of for these many centuries and millennia, you might call a sort of normal schizophrenia, meaning we're this person, then we're this person, and now we're this person, but we can't hold them all together. So we're fragmented. And this leads to all sorts of problems. It particularly leads to problems around understanding ourselves in the world, because there's so much of ourselves in the world that aren't accommodated by the everyday waking consciousness. So that particularly is true in the pandemic, where we have, we succumb to this fear, and that's the predominant tone at the moment. It's lessening a bit now, but we've been very preoccupied with this fear of this horrible agent of disease is coming and it's going to destroy me. And that we keep out of our awareness most of the time, but it lives in our dream state reality, in the what we sometimes call the mythical reality, where the stories are. Well, the story is that there is this virus that's out there and it's going to attack us, and we are helpless, and so we're terrified. And that becomes a dominant way of dealing with the situation, though most of the time we keep it unconscious because it's too troubling and too frightening for us. And then there's another level of consciousness, which has a lot more to do with the interplay of nature and the flow and ebb of life and death, and of microbes that live in our body and shape who we are. And all of that interconnection with nature is what we sometimes call the magic structure of consciousness. And those who've written about this, like Jean Gebser, some of you know about, but others may not, but many people have written about this. And they tend to discount, we all actually tend to discount magic as something that is fraudulent. It's not real, but it is. But that magic structure of consciousness is real, because our connection with nature and our the way that all these smells and tastes and electromagnetic waves from the planet all flow through us and connect us is very real, but not something that we are conscious of at all in most cases. But rarely there are people who may be attuned to that, who are very sensitive. But all of these are operating and when we are awake, they don't operate. At night, we go into those spaces, but when we come back, we don't remember it. So this is all very dicey to live in that fragmented way. And so the yogis say, the Tantrikas say, and many sages have said all over the world in various traditions, that the time is coming when we recover our fuller consciousness of all these different realities, and that we can hold them at once. Hold them, the best word is transparently, because it's this one and this one and this one, and we're equally in all of them at any moment. When we reach that state, we become integrated instead of fragmented. And so sometimes these days, the catchword is integral consciousness. So this is integral consciousness. Now, in our training programs, we often read Jean Gebser, because he was a European philosopher and writer about consciousness, who put all this into Western terms. But in the Eastern tradition, it's something that has been well known, but the terminology is somewhat different. But in both cases, it is said that spiritual goal is to reach this integral consciousness where we can hold all of what is there at one time within our awareness, and then we're not fragmented. And so in some traditions, that's called self-realization, meaning I realize the true self is all of this. And in other traditions, the various ways of talking about it. But it's really a universal theme that is not unique to one part of the world. It's many cultures over almost probably every culture.
So you've also talked about, so we talked about the magical and the mythical and the mental as states of consciousness that Gebser discussed. You've also discussed the efficient and deficient forms of these. So the deficient magical, the efficient mythical, the efficient mental. And I'm really curious these days, given what's going on in terms of what is this virus and the conspiracy theories and all the craziness in the conversation around it, how do we define what efficient mental is in this environment, or the efficient deficient mythical. You know, we need heroes, we need villains, we need a story, or the magical. There's definitely some magical thinking, you know, drink Clorox and everything will be fine. But that might be deficient magical thinking. So I'm just curious, you know, how, in order to reach this integral, we need to use these states of consciousness efficiently. Can you address that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, first, let me clarify for those who are not familiar with this paradigm in any of its forms, that implicit in this is the concept that we have, in the course of evolution, human evolution, we have gone through being primarily in one or another of these structures of consciousness that we're calling magic, mythical, and mental, and integral. And that we move progressively to the next one. And so that's a very profound way of perspective and difficult kind of to wrap your mind around. But we would say that in tribal cultures, in much of the world, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, people living in tribal cultures lived mostly in the magic structure of consciousness, where they were connected with nature and really a part of nature. They didn't really sense themselves as something distinct from nature, and are only very slightly distinct from nature. And that's the magic structure of consciousness. Now, eventually, that magic structure of consciousness, which was really delicious because it made us sensually aware of how we were so connected with all the plants and the trees and the animals and the flow of energy and everything. But that became, as we began to become more conscious, a bit of ego came into that, so that we learned that that connection could be used to make things happen, which is where we get the idea of magic from. And then that became deficient magic. And that then we lost some of our connection with the flow of nature in our effort to try to make something happen and get something that we wanted. And so as that crumbled, it became deficient and crumbled, that set us up for the next structure of consciousness, which is the mythical, where we've discovered a whole new way of positioning ourselves in the universe, where we are related to each other in a way that's not identical, but somehow polarity, like you're this and I'm that, but we're still one, but I'm one end of the polarity and you're the other end of the polarity. And that was still a connected way. And that's where we had all of the stories and the myths and the gods and goddesses, and all this became very real because they were real. And so, but then the deficient mythical came along, where it was so many stories and so much, it's just too much. And finally people felt like they were so submerged in all of this psychic phenomena that they had to find a place to climb out of it, out of that deficient mythical. And then, somewhere in Greece, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, this began to emerge in the West, the mental structure of consciousness, the intellect, the use of reason and logic and rationality. And that lifted us out of that confusion. So there's always this progression and this deterioration. So now we've been in the mental, intellectual for quite a while, and we've driven it into the ground, so to speak, that we are now so much in our heads and so mental and so intellectual that we've lost completely our touch at being in touch with nature, and we've lost completely the beauty of the stories and the myths and we have this proliferation of kind of intellectualized myths that's on television and movies and films, and it goes on and now the part of the mental is to analyze and break down into parts to understand. So we've broken everything down in parts, so we're even more fragmented and alienated from each other. So we're deeply in the deficient mental, so that people, when we used to rely on people to tell the truth, well, which truth? Well, well, that's fake truth, and this is fake news, and this, well, that's real. Well, no, I said that, but so that's real, but no, maybe that's not. And this, so we don't know what's real anymore, and we're feeling very confused and very disoriented, which is part of what happens. Is one of the things that happens with that deficient mental is we can't even put together who we are. So we lose our sense of identity, and we don't know, am I this or am I that? And then when we lose our sense of identity, our immune system collapses, because the immune system defends our integrity. But if we don't know where the boundaries are, then what is it defending? And it just doesn't work very well. And so we become prone to all kinds of illnesses and disasters. So we're deeply in the deficient mental. But the good news is that deeply into the deficient mental means we are right on the cusp of moving into the integral. And that's what will save our skins, is that if we can move into the integral, where we are more conscious of nature and we quit trying to destroy it for our own egotistical reasons. The ego, the elaboration of an outsized ego, is certainly part of the deficient mental. And so this is really the exciting part of using this framework to think about the pandemic. Is this pandemic have something to do with moving out of the deficient mental into the integral, to all kind of connecting with everyone? And I don't know.
So can you give us an example of the deficient mental and the efficient mental? Because it seems to me don't we need to have a good grasp on the efficient mental before we can move into what you call integral consciousness?
Yes, well, that is how it's been framed always, that you want to embrace all of these realities, but you don't want to embrace the deficient version, because it won't all fit together. It'll be chaotic. But if you can take the efficient mental, where there's pure, clear logic and reason that holds up under scrutiny, and the efficient mythical, which is the true stories that relate to us as spiritual beings and guide us, and the efficient magic, which is the awareness of the flow of microbes through us. Like there are millions of viruses all inside of us and outside of us, and coming in on the winds from other continents, and they're viruses, and the viruses are reshaping and reconstructing our genetic material constantly to adjust to the new situations. And so if we really can sense that in its clarity as a part of who we are, rather than as a foreign agent, then we have a whole different approach to being ill and understanding what the sickness is about, and so forth.
So then are you saying that the efficient mental requires use of the magical and the mythical in order for it to...
The integral requires all three. The efficient mental has existed as something that we were solely conscious of, purely conscious of just the mental structure of consciousness, and had the magic and mythical that happened in sleep. But to go into the integral, something new has to happen. You can't just go to that one and forget the others. You have to embrace all of them. And that's a new challenge for humanity. And that's what's so intimidating right now, according to the Tantrikas and according to the Gebserians and according to many people, is that we're trying to take this giant step to hold all of these structures at once, so that we are aware then of what's going on everywhere at every moment. And that's like, oh, that's ridiculous, you can't do that. Well, we at the moment aren't able to do that, except every now and then we can a bit. We do move beyond time, space, and causality. We have a glimpse of something's going to happen tomorrow, and it happens. Or we're We are, the time runs back. I mean, all kinds of weird things are happening now as people are opening into the integral, and the old rules are falling apart. And we rely on our concepts, a deficient mental version of our concepts of causation. Well, what's causing this pandemic? You know, well, like there's a whole raft of things that are changing and shifting, and this is part of it. But we really would like to say that caused it. Now because that appeals to our deficient mental way of thinking. Yeah.
And one of the principles that you've talked a lot about is the power of pleasure. Now, a lot of people are in a situation of being by themselves or possibly with somebody they don't really want to touch. So I imagine it's posing a lot of interesting challenges for people to connect, particularly erotically, when that's very, very difficult if you're by yourself and you're in a lockdown. So I'm curious, is this a kind of restriction that might actually be a tapas in the Sanskrit term that could help people deal with habits that they've been wanting to change? Or, I'm just curious on your thoughts about that.
I didn't quite wrap my mind around the question embedded in that discussion, though.
So I guess the question is, what is the power of pleasure at a time when people are erotically challenged and then forced back on themselves to cope with what for many is a really difficult situation?
Yeah, well, so one of the themes that we've talked about in our tantric work is the path of pleasure. And Arabella knows about that because she wrote a paper on it. The path of pleasure. So pleasure is something the definition of which changes as we move along. So we may consider this particular thing pleasurable, but after a while it's not so pleasurable because we're getting bored with it, and so what? And then we discover something that is more pleasurable. So you could map from the most simple and sort of gross or physical pleasures, like eating something that's delicious, to the pleasure of being one with the universe, which is like way up there. But along the way, I make my way along that path, which is called the spiritual path, actually, by moving from this thing that I think is pleasurable to something that, no, it's more subtly and exquisitely pleasurable than the last thing. And then I discover something that's even more pleasurable. That will lead us eventually to the pleasure of sitting in meditation and connecting with the whole universe, which is so intensely pleasurable that the sages have not ever been able to describe it in words. So we're not all going to become illuminated this week because of the pandemic. However, we have the opportunity to expand our sense of what's pleasurable. And we can do that through our own inner process. And that, it won't work. You won't manage to do that if you think, well, sitting in meditation is a chore and it's something I hate to do, but I know I ought to, so I'm going to sit here. No, you're not going to get there like that. We have to say, well, what is the pleasure of sitting here? The pleasure of closing my eyes and going deep inside. What is the sort of juicy, delicious, sensual aspect of that? And as we discover that, we move along this path, finding the more exquisite pleasure, the more delightful pleasure. And it may have nothing at all to do with physically touching someone, because I'm touching everyone. When I'm inside and I'm in that space, I'm connected to everyone in the universe, and it's all exquisitely sensual and delightful and overwhelmingly pleasurable. So we're getting a little bump, you know, like a little nudge. Okay, well, sometimes I think what this pandemic is about is that we have been destroying the environment, we've been destroying ourselves, eating bad food, poisoned food, full of chemicals. We've been, you know, doing all of these things, taking drugs, whether they're prescription drugs or recreational drugs, or you know, running around in circles, busy all the time, never stop because we don't want to stop and deal with what's inside. And it's gotten so bad that I imagine this cosmic whistle being blown. All right, stop. Everybody, go to your room and stay there until I tell you otherwise. So we all go to our room and we're, oh, I'm in isolation. I can't go out because of the pandemic. Well, yeah, but why? Take advantage of this opportunity to be alone and rethink, what am I doing with my life? What am I mean, you know, they in West Africa, they give a root called iboga to the young people. And when they take that root and chew it, they go into a state. And the iboga man comes and he says, what are you doing with your life? What are you here for? Wake up. And they go, oh, okay. And they quit being frivolous and running around doing silly adolescent things, and they grow up. And that's a rite of entry into adulthood in that culture. And it's been used, the extract of that's been used in drug addiction, ibogaine, it's called. And that's what happens. People who are addicted to opium, particularly heroin, opiates, heroin, whatever, and they go into this altered state, and the iboga man comes and he says, "Oh, what are you doing? You know, are you crazy?" And they go, "Oh, well, whoa, right." And a huge percentage, like 90% of people, never use heroin again after that experience. Of course, it was made illegal in the United States, but you can do it in Canada, you can do it in Mexico, whatever. So this is kind of an iboga experience here. That go to your room, you can't do the things you usually do. Now just examine, who am I? What do I want? Why am I here? What have I been doing up till now that I don't want to keep doing anymore? Well, this has been a help. This breaks my habits because I'm not allowed to go out and do what I used to do. So what do I want to go back to? What do I want to never go back to? This is an opportunity. It's a marvelous experience and a marvelous time. And so my question for all of you, you know, you're asking me all these questions. My question for all of you is, does this pandemic really bump you, nudge you toward the integral structure of consciousness? Is that what it's all about? Is it a big step to break apart some of our so deeply rooted habits and ways of living and being in the world, and ways of wastefulness and self-destruction and all that? Because maybe that's what it is. Oh, I wish someone would answer because I want to know. Somebody's got the answer.
You can open up for people to either answer the question that Swamiji has posed us, or if you have a question you yourself would like to pose, feel free. The floor is now open.
Okay, thank you. The offer expires in 15 minutes. So better ask now.
Well, while people are thinking about their question or their answer, I will ask one more, and that is death. What do the principles have to tell us about the fear of death, which of course is driving so much of the craziness around the pandemic?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a great question. And certainly we are a society that is preoccupied with fear of death. That drives all of us much of the time. And one of the marvelous things about the integral structure of consciousness is that when you enter the integral structure of consciousness, you're not only aware of the living, but also the dead. You're also aware of both sides of that that wall or whatever it is that the veil that separates us from the other world. And therefore you discover that, oh, well, death was not such, I mean, how trivial a thing it is. I mean, I can be here, I can be there, so what? I can go back this one, back there, you know, it's like discovering that on the other side of the wall is a whole nother world. And we, in our deficient mental state, we are particularly separate from that because we have been so focused on developing our intellect, our ability to see from our perspective. You know, so art changed when we moved into the mental structure of consciousness. Instead of art looking like Grandma Moses, you know, flat, it became perspective. And we said, oh, art became more sophisticated, more intelligent. Well, in a way it did, because it lets the world, I paint a picture, it lets the world know what I see from my perspective. But it doesn't say anything about what the person next to me sees, or we as a group see. So we lost something in that. We lost in moving into that perspectival consciousness. We lost a sense of connection and a sense of wholeness. And so we lost our sense of what is death. Instead of it being a transition, it became a totally separated thing. So it's cut apart, this fragmentation. So death is separate from life. And, you know, it's just this terrifying possibility, because if the ego goes, then the world ends, right? Well, no. That was
okay. So I think we can open it up for a question. Rudy, could you repeat the question you had for the group earlier?
Yes, I asked, is this pandemic, is the purpose of this pandemic to nudge us toward integral consciousness?
Great. And so if you have something you'd like to say, simply unmute yourself and go ahead.
Ben has a question. How does Tantra relate to permaculture design?
Yeah, well, Tantra, I think of permaculture, and I live in a permaculture village, and we're all trained in permaculture, and we practice permaculture as a way of relating to nature and as a way of operating in terms of governance, and the way and as a perspective for education. For all of our activities are approached through, we attempt to approach them through a permaculture mindset. So I think of permaculture as Tantra applied. It's like the applied version of Tantra, because we're actually relating to the earth and to our being in a way that implements the principles of Tantra. So we treat, like we go outside, like I was outside today, you know, planting things and clipping things, and it's like I'm clipping Gaia's toenails and polishing them for her. So this is an act of adoration of the feminine, of the goddess. So this is Tantra applied. And if you look at the two, actually 10 years ago, myself and one of the other residents of this permaculture village, did a 2-month, 3-month live-in training in permaculture and Tantra together. So it was an experiment in teaching the two as one. And that was very interesting and very exciting. So yeah, that's my answer.
Hi, Swami Ravi. It's Cece.
Yes. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for offering this every week, and thank you for opening the discussion with your question. I don't pretend to have an answer to it. But it is a question that has often crossed my mind, and I don't think that there is a blanket answer. Like, there are many people in my life for whom this has become a wake-up call and an opportunity to engage differently, make different choices.
Yeah.
And there are many people in my life who can't wait to get back to normal because that worked so well for them, I guess.
Well, did it really work so well for them, or was it familiar? And familiar seems less scary and more kind of comfortable in a sort of retreating way. Like, you know, I can go back to what I know, and I don't have all this uncertainty. So one week we did do a meditation on embracing uncertainty, because clearly when you make a radical shift into a transformational shift, you don't know what to expect, because if it's something you already know about, it's not a real transformation. So when we enter this new way of being, we're bound to feel a little scared, a little, Linda, what did you call it? Living in the gap between the old. Well, I'm trying to let go of the old, but I don't want to let go of the old until I know what the new is. And I won't know what the new is until I let go of the old. And I'm like, what do I do? So yeah, I think people want to get back to normal, the norm, because it's familiar and it's not scary. I mean, it is scary actually, but I've gotten used to that scary part. I don't think about it anymore. I don't think about that this is unsustainable the way we're living. And if it's unsustainable, it'll end. I mean, that's just, how can you argue with that? I mean, if it's unsustainable, it's going to stop. Well, maybe it's stopping. It has stopped here for a while. Wow. And yet, if it stops, then what happens to us? Well, maybe something really incredible happens to us that takes us out of all the madness we've been immersed in. But how can we know if we don't step into it? So it's not for the faint of heart, but it's the future. I mean, you know, it's something that mankind has been working toward for a long, long time, and something that if we are privileged to step into that, that's really something to celebrate. Yeah. Thank you.
And the tool for us to step into that integral is meditation.
Yeah, well, meditation is one very important tool to use in as you face that transition, as you move toward a new structure of consciousness, a new way of being in the world. Meditation helps you root yourself and helps you bring, I mean, the very practice of meditation is designed to lead you into these various realms of reality, realms or realities, stepwise. When you sit for meditation, you know, first you kind of drift off and you start having something kind of like little images popping up or little scenes. well, you're moving into the mythical. And then if you let that go and just keep, focusing on mantra, your breath, whatever, then eventually you come to where it's just light and maybe color, and it's like you're in the magic. And then eventually, if you can go further, you become one with everything, and you have this beautiful experience of oneness. Meditation is designed to take us into the integral. That's what it was developed for. And it works if you do it. And it takes time, and you go stepwise, but don't, that's no reason to not do it. Just takes a little patience,
So Ocean Phillips made a comment, simple answer to the question. Yes, this is an evolutionary moment, and how lucky we are to be alive at this time. And Arabella has a question.
Well, I want to agree with Ocean. Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, no, Arabella.
Ravi ji, I noticed that in your earlier discussion of the realms of consciousness, you didn't actually touch at all upon the archaic, which Gebser describes as the kind of almost non-space, non-time. In fact, non-space, non-time, not almost, which in the Sufi tradition that I studied for a long period of time, we would call the one, the oneness. And it seems to me that when I meditate, I visit the archaic quite regularly. And I'm wondering about the role of that non-temporal, non-spatial source in the integral. It parallels some of the things you said earlier about the, Pure Valaya, my first teacher, way back in the 70s, used to talk about samadhi with open eyes. So I'm curious as to what you're thinking about the archaic right now.
Yes. Well, I was very conscious of not mentioning the archaic, but I try to keep it, not make it so complicated. But okay. Yes, the archaic, you could also speak of it as the source, or out of which we emerge, the oneness in its purity. When we say the integral, the archaic is definitely a part of that. So when we're in the integral structure of consciousness, the archaic is present along with the magic, the mythical, and the mental. And it is that from which everything emerges, the oneness from which everything emerges in its pure form, the oneness. So if we do go there at night, you may do it in meditation, and that's wonderful because that's beginning to create the integral. But we all go there in that dreamless sleep. In the deepest part of the sleep, we go back to the source, the archaic, the from where we originated, and that nourishes us and sustains us. If we're not allowed to go there, we go crazy. If you sleep deprived people, they go nuts because you need to connect with that. And each time we move into a new structure of consciousness, there's a fresh burst of connection with the archaic, with the source. So the next structure of consciousness always reconnects you with source and brings that grounding in source back into your life when you've wandered from it in the last deficient phase. Does that make sense? Yeah. Somebody have a question?
I just want to say thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's great. Somebody?
I have a question.
2 minutes.
Sure. This is Adam, and I was my brain's a little full right now from what was just shared, but as we move through the different structures of consciousness, how does the way we engage with pleasure shift or change, or how can we follow our pleasure into the integral?
Yeah, it will take you there. Pleasure. If you keep looking for the more subtle and refined and delightful and juicy pleasure, it will take you gradually through the different structures to the integral. And yes, it changes. It's always changing. That's the beauty of pleasure, is you can't, you know, you try to do it like I wrote in one of the books, I can't remember which one that I wrote, about I made this meal and it was so delicious, you know, it was just exquisite. And I thought, oh, I have to do that again. And I did everything the same. And then it just wasn't that interesting, you know. I mean, you can't, it's not something you can capture. And that's the beauty of pleasure, is that after this pleasure, that same one won't work anymore. You can do it and you can try to convince yourself, oh yeah, this is great, but actually it's not so great as it was the first time, because this is a process of finding, connecting more and moving toward more connection and more extension of your interaction with the universe. And then that pleasure, you know, is each time it's a new level of that. So, right, we need, when we're working with people and teaching and doing sessions one-on-one or whatever, to be aware of that dynamic quality of pleasure. And that's why the pleasure is healing in a way, because it leads us to the next step and the next step. And if we are moving from one step to the other and we're alive. If we stop that movement, we're increasingly dead. Does that kind of throw some light on it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Swami Ravi. That was wonderful. That all passed way too quickly, and I imagine there are lots of questions out there. But I hope that perhaps we can do this again so that people can pose questions to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. I really enjoy your inquiries. And thank everybody for your questions and for listening and for being here. And please take advantage of this unique time in history. And it never happened. The whole planet kind of stopped. Yeah. Wow, this is unprecedented. Jump on it. Jump on it. Okay.
Yes, Andrew, thank you, Andrew, for participating this evening and facilitating and the discussion. But I really like that idea that if you do have a question that comes up, any one of you, during the week or at some time, or maybe it's in your meditation, something comes up, don't hesitate to send us that question, and perhaps we'll integrate it into something that we're offering the next week, or either as a part of meditation the next week, or what have you. Mm-hmm. We love questions, we love curiosity, and it drives what we do, and drives how we respond, and drives the content. So if that comes up, please send the question to dancingshivatantra@gmail.com, and or the website. Look at the website. You can leave something there, or you can contact us there, whatever. So, thank you, Swami Ravi, for participating.
Thanks, Gerald. Set it all up and made it happen.
Thank you, Linda, for holding the space with Zoom.
Yes, thank you, Linda.
And it's lovely to see all your faces. Lovely to have you participating. We'll be back next week with a meditation at the same time. Perhaps the meditation will incorporate some of the content from tonight.
Yeah. Oh, surely.
So maybe some pleasure will be in there. So enjoy. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.